So, a while ago, a few months, I was having an argument with strangers on the internet, one of my classic flaws, and it was a fairly typical leftist who, regurgitated the usual mindless platitude: the culture war is just a distraction from the class war. And I posed an interesting hypothetical. I said, all right, well, I'm not married to capitalism. I can see its flaws. What would you be willing to sacrifice to form a coalition with culturally conservative minded people who might be willing to go along and seek legitimate reform in our current free market system? I gave an example. Would you be willing to abandon the trans rights movement to form this coalition? And he said, well, why would I have to do that? We should care about the plights of all people. But, I thought those plights were just a distraction. What he really meant was, when he said the culture war is just a distraction from the class war, he meant, you're wrong and just agree with me and don't argue. He didn't have a genuine, austere interest in, making a little bit of a compromise and pursuing something more worthwhile, because he poises himself as this someone that is a more principled socialist, that is somehow different in their ideals from the typical liberal, but their socially progressive values are functionally interchangeable. The liberal may be more insistent upon the right to individual self-expression with no sense of responsibility to the community and no sense of shame. And even if the, so-called socialist, non-liberal socialist, claims to not care about these things as much, you'll never see them actually set these things aside to make a coalition with people who may nominally be interested in aligning with them on these issues. Someone such as myself, who is culturally conservative and does not think that mindless consumerism and hypermaterialism is actually all that good for traditional values. And it got me to thinking, actually, the culture war is the class war. What demographics are the largest proponents of socially progressive values? Let's think about that for a moment. When you look at anything from Pew Research Center, from any sort of Gallup polls, the people who are the most socially liberal tend to be materially affluent people, upper middle class people, suburbanites, college educated white people, especially women. And they tend to be utterly disconnected from the people who are working class that they claim to speak for when it comes to matters of wealth redistribution. And they tend to be totally disconnected from the people whose communities are alienated by socially progressive values, this hyper individualism, this notion of a lack of belief in some purpose in life greater than yourself, some need to contemplate the value of your behavior as a member of a collective, and instead simply valuing finding some form of fulfillment in self-expression. In other words, hedonistic indulgence. And there's a lot of historical examples where progressive social values were astroturfed onto the working class. Even segregation, for example, if you go back in history and you look at who was protesting desegregation in the South, it wasn't just racist white people in the South, but it was also black communities, because the simple truth is the best teachers for black students were black teachers. The simple truth is in-group preference is completely normal, and black teachers had more of an intrinsic incentive to provide higher quality, tightly knit, intimate mentorship of black students. And this shows in the performance results in testing of the students who integrated during that time period of the 1950s and 1960s. For a lot of them, their performances went down when they integrated into multi ethnic schools. And you can see that not only did this have consequences in the short term, but it's failed to actually rectify the natural intuition of group preference in the long term. If you look at the areas where protesting was most prominent in the South, you'll see that enrollment in private schools, where people can be more selective with what students they let in, what kind of community is formed in that school, what kind of cultural norms are dominant in that school, the rates are far, far higher than the national average, than pretty much anywhere else, except, funnily enough, the San Francisco Bay Area also has very high rates of um, private school enrollment. And that is also, interestingly enough, a very multi ethnic liberal enclave. And yet clearly they see the value in finding a place in which people are going to have some sort of shared value system, some sort of shared vision for how to shape the future generations' outlook for the future. And, on the flip side of that, even when considering more recent issues, LGBT rights, feminism, uh, workplace representation, DEI, all that nonsense, um, and modern secular cosmopolitan values, the people of the working class that the left claims to speak for do not have these values, broadly speaking. And that includes minorities. I'm not just talking about working class white agricultural people in communitarian environments. Many working class black people tend to be more religious than their white working class cohorts, especially Baptists, and they tend to not actually be as supportive of things like LGBT rights and feminism. A lot of Hispanic people, also in the working class, tend to be Catholic, similar, definitely not contemporary, progressive, liberal social values. These people are, broadly speaking, not as hyper individualist as these hedonistic liberals. They tend to be more community minded. They tend to base the most important decisions of their individual self expression with some degree of responsibility in mind to the community at large. They understand that too much deviation from a norm causes unneeded lack of cohesion in socialization. And, the simple truth is the unwillingness of people who espouse, to varying extents, progressive liberal social values is a form of class warfare, because ultimately one of the best ways to oppress the working class is to eradicate their culture, eradicate what makes them unique. This is a big part of why people who are heavily capitalist but also socially liberal are so pro open borders, because one of the best ways to break down a tightly knit community is to import a ton of people with different cultural values and to obfuscate the otherwise dominant set of cultural norms in a more tightly knit community. And I think this is a much more direct, a more obvious example. They want to erase local cultures, not just of the local community, but the community from which people are being immigrated out of. They are taking away the laborers of foreign countries and weakening community bonds of the people that were living in those previous countries. And so it has a twofold effect, not just here in the United States of weakening our communities, but it also weakens the cultures in other communities, and it reduces us to economic units. It reduces our communities to economic zones. Laborers and consumers, nothing more. Just a form of material value that can be quantified and stripped of immeasurable qualities. And so to reiterate, the culture war is not a distraction from the class war. You need to hold on to the cultural values that make your community, however niche, however secluded, you need to hold on to those values because those are what distinguish you as a group from just being a group of workers, of consumers, of being just like everyone else. Communities, while not as great numerically as the entire nation, are still greater than the individual and are capable of maintaining a true identity beyond just hedonistic indulgence. And so I say the culture war is the class war. If you like what I have to say, please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you.